Thinking about buying or selling a home care agency? You're in the right place. In this episode of the Home Care Experience with T&A, Amy Taylor and Troy Brooks dive deep into the world of mergers and acquisitions, minus the corporate buzzwords. From legal pitfalls and provider number transfers to due diligence disasters and tax landmines, this is everything you didn't know you needed to know. Whether it's your first deal or your fifth, they'll walk you through what matters with candor and clarity. Let's talk about buying and selling the home care way.
Welcome back to another episode of the Home Care Experience with T&A. I am Amy Taylor and Troy Brooks, and we're going to talk about buying and selling, otherwise known as mergers and acquisitions, but we just discussed we're not fancy like that, so we call it buying and selling. So if you're looking at buying or selling an agency, kind of some considerations to keep top of mind, and just also kind of how that process unfolds and what it looks like. So okay. What do you got, Troy? How's that work?
This is one of those areas where what you do and what I do directly or more commonly overlaps. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. I think one of the misconceptions that people have is like there's some sort of path or some sort of written blueprint that you're stuck to, and when you're purchasing or selling an agency. And it's not. It depends on it depends on so many things. It depends on the people. It depends on what everybody agrees to. I think people's biggest struggle is they're only going to do it a few times. I mean, unless you're in a development, you're in charge of development for a provider in which you go out and you look for agencies to buy. Most of the time, people are going to be this their one time doing it, or twice or whatever. And so I think people just don't know what it looks like. And so that's their biggest thing. So as I said, there's no one way, but normally in a good situation that's not rushed, a lot of times people want to rush. That's an issue in and of itself. Sometimes you can rush, sometimes you can't. But generally the steps sort of go like this. First, there is somebody sees an agency they're interested in, and so they say, hey, we want to take a little bit better look at you. So we'll do a non-disclosure agreement with you. So that allows you, if you're the seller, to share information, and the other side promises to keep it confidential, usually financial information. And then you'll have that'll be exchanged. And then the next step, if the buyer is still interested, the next step is that the buyer will put together a letter of intent, an LOI. Now, a lot of times, there's a rule of thumb that applies to all of this, which is you're better off not signing anything without talking to a lawyer first. Mm-hmm. I used to be really hesitant on saying that, thinking that, well, that's self-promoting and over-promoting. I've seen too many blow-ups to know that people who in this business, they go a long time without having to deal with a lawyer. Mm-hmm. And so when they get into this situation, they think they're in that same mindset. You're in a different world. It's a heavily regulated transaction. There are a lot of pieces to it and moving parts. So one of the things that people get tripped up on sometimes is they say, well, this is a non-binding LOI. In Texas, a lot of places, just because it says non-binding doesn't mean it's really non-binding. It really depends on the context of what's written. It depends on a whole bunch of other things. So even though you're signing something that has at the top non-binding, it still could be binding. There are too many variables. That is a discussion in and of itself. The biggest thing about that is that whole thing about don't sign anything until you talk to a lawyer is your signature means something. And there's this old adage in Louisiana law that your signature is not ornamental. It's just not there for looks. Now, in this business, people sign stuff all the time that it's just a requirement you sign it. I mean, now a lot of times you are, affirming the truth of what you sign. I mean, that kind of thing. But we have electronic signatures. We used to have rubber stamp signatures. And because they're so common. But at the same time, that commonness, I think, makes us forget that it's important and it means something. So think about that when you're signing an LOI, that it might be binding, even though it says not binding. And that sounds crazy. It may have a label at the top. Labels in this matter, it's content and context that matters, not labels. The next step would be a stock purchase agreement.
Before you go there, I got some thoughts. That's why I wrote them down. So, when you very first started, you said, a lot of people don't know what to expect. And I have a feeling, or what I've seen is I feel like people are either one or the other. If they've never been through it before, they either think, oh, wow, this is no big deal. And we're two friendly parties and it's going to be super easy and everything's going to be great and kosher. Or they're like super scared and like, I was like, oh my God, this is a huge undertaking. I don't know where to start. And I'm sure it's a spectrum of where people land, but I think getting professional guidance is step number one. That will help sort through that. And I would also caution against the real easy and everybody's really willing and agreeing. Well,
this, it's funny. It's like you hear people in family law situations, we're getting a divorce, it's all amicable. Well, it can end up not so much. It's easy. You have a loved one dies, they don't have a will or they have a will. People who got along perfectly fine when that person was alive, all of a sudden turn on each other.
Well, I can speak firsthand to that stuff.
Yeah, it happens. It's just human nature. Yeah. And so to think that goodness, that whatever goodwill and everything that you have is still going to be there at the time of closing. If you start talking to somebody, that's a bet. That's a gamble. So what I was going to do is walk through these and then go back to each one and sort of discuss some of the ins and outs of them. So the next step is you do a stock purchase or an asset purchase agreement of some sort, be it stock or asset. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. That is a document that says, basically it goes into detail on the structure. It has the seller will warrant certain things, make warranties of certain things. The buyer will also make warranties as to their ability to purchase, that kind of thing. And then you get to the closing. And we say closing, I think that is a term that is left over from when you closed escrow on something, like when you're buying a house and the money's in escrow, you close escrow, the closing. Okay. So I think that's where that comes from, because it's not really, we all use the term, but there's nothing that really closes, just keys change hand.
Closing the deal.
Yeah. Now, let's talk about, so the NDA is pretty simple. I mean, it just says, hey, I'm going to give you this stuff, but you ain't going to give it to anybody. All right, fine. The LOI, again, it gets to where you're getting into some tricky territory there, because like I said, it could be binding, even though it says it's not. Okay, at the LOI stage, that's when you're going to start talking to the buyer, one, about a proposed purchase price, which can change. Okay. And then how they're going to pay it. And so the structure of the deal, and that goes to asset versus stock purchase. All right. So this is a stage that if you haven't been talking to your CPA, you need to start talking to, especially if you're the seller, because there are going to be tax liabilities involved. What they are, and it varies depending on the time, so many variables. One of my struggles with talking to clients sometimes, especially new ones, about this kind of thing is trying to explain that I can't give you like a clear, this is how this is going to go, because there's so many variables. You're going to make decisions. You make decisions at step one. Okay, they affect where step two lands. Step two lands here. You make other decisions. Step three, and it opens the door to options. It closes the door to options, depending on the choices you make at each step. Now, these steps, the NDA, the LOI, the purchase agreement, none of that's written in stone. I have had situations that jump straight to the purchase agreement. They bypass doing it in the NDA or LOI. Those are not, there's nothing in statute. There's nothing written. It's not in the Bible that you have to do NDA, LOI, start a purchase agreement. And then close it. It's not. So it's up to the parties. This just, what the structure I'm talking about, it's common because it gives everybody it establishes a process by which you basically which the buyer is going to look and do what's their due diligence on the status of the agency.
And that falls under that NDA part.
Yes.
I mean, the non-disclosure.
Well, it starts at the NDA because they're going to look at some financials, but the LOI sets out a due diligence period where they actually, in healthcare, you want to have some look, especially Medicare certified agency, you want to have some look at their clinical records.
Yep.
Because that is your biggest exposure in home health, hospice in Texas, and a lot of places. Your biggest exposure are Medicare overpayments and employee injuries. I mean, you have exposure for mal and things like that, but medical malpractice and things like that. But those are the two big ones. And actually, there's so many ways to handle a transaction and be able to protect yourself as a buyer from overpayments that were generated on the seller's watch, your former owner's watch. Just different steps you can take.
And billing records. Is that
billing? And so the reason I mentioned the clinical is the billing records, they give birth to the clinical records give birth to the billing records. And so what I have found is what was billed is basically what is documented needs to match what's billed. Okay. And so depending on with home health and hospice, I mean, it's different from, say, a physician's office where you have multiple codes that are being billed depending on what the patient's needs are. But essentially, that documentation, the sufficiency of it is it gives you an indication of how well the agency was run.
Yeah.
And what kind of exposure am I have? The clinical due diligence part is probably
the biggest.
I mean, it's the heaviest. By this point, you've looked at the NDA. You know if they paid their taxes. You know if they did this. You know that they did that. So all that general stuff is there. I mean, there might be some other things out there, but
the financial side is really, if you ask me, the due diligence on the financial side is fairly basic. It's very easy to contact the IRS and make sure all taxes are filed and make sure there's no outstanding tax debt with payroll, with income taxes, whatever, so those are pretty easy. Same with the state, it's easy to figure those things out.
Well, see, one of the things I do is if I'm representing the purchaser, I'll do a search for liens. I mean, those are fairly simple for me to do. Just through the structure of the firms, we have subscriptions to different services and stuff like that. So that's pretty easy to do. It's the clinical stuff where you have to, that's your exposure. Because whether or not you do an asset purchase or stock purchase, it doesn't matter. Any Medicare overpayment is going to stay with it's going to go to the new owner.
Yeah, because they're buying the provider number.
Essentially, yes. I mean, technically it's not, technically they're not, but that's that's a slang we use in the industry. They're buying a provider number.
But technically they're not? I mean, I know technically they're not buying patients.
Yeah, technically not. You're buying the goodwill.
But they're buying the license.
Well, licenses aren't transferable. This is where it gets weird.
Okay.
Because with a stock purchase, it's like you go and you want, let's say you have an auto repair shop that you want to buy. Well, you can go in and you can just buy the equipment they have and say, I want all your customer list and all that, buy that, and then set up your own, set up next door in a different garage. Or that would be an asset purchase. Or you can buy the building, the contents, everything to do the business, everything about the business, customer list, everything. That's more like a stock purchase.
Including the EIN number.
Including the EIN. That's the important part. With a stock purchase, or if you're a limited liability company, a membership purchase, the EIN is not going to change.
Right.
Okay. There are certain circumstances where it would. Stock, not so much. Maybe sometimes with an LLC, but I'm not really ran into that. Partnerships, yes. Okay. But that's a different animal altogether. Most of the ones I'm dealing with are LLCs because for some reason their CPAs like LLCs.
Not this one, but go ahead.
No, but I know somebody else that is. Well, there was a time in Texas, at least, that you didn't have to pay franchise tax with it as an LLC. And people seem to think that it's less onerous as far as the corporate governance and all that. And I don't think you should make decisions based on a fear of paperwork.
Yeah.
Because the corporate governance is not complex paperwork. It's just, you just document what you did. So Medicare for the provider number does not consider a stock purchase to be a change of ownership. The company is a business entity; it remains the same, and so for that reason, a lot of folks in mergers and acquisitions, buying and selling, home health and hospice, they choose the stock purchase because of that smooth transition.
And so can I give my explanation of stock purchase? So I look at a stock purchase as being, here's the thing. Amy Taylor owns ABC Home Care. ABC Home Care owns the license and the provider number. That's who owns. If you look at the ownership in the 855, the owner of that provider number is ABC Home Care, not Amy Taylor, right? So when I'm ready to sell, I'm going to sell my personal shares, my ownership to this company. So it's just for Medicare, it's just a change of information because now the owner of the stock is different than the ABC Home Care still owns that provider number. It's just who owns ABC Home Care. And that's why it makes it easier.
Yes.
However, you assume all liability.
Yeah, that's why. And in other businesses, let's say the auto repair shop thing, you might not want the stock because you're going to inherit any civil liability they have. The reason for this is that LLC or corporation in Texas is considered like a legal person. It's a fictitious person, but it's like a person. That business entity is like a person. In Louisiana law, it's considered a juridical person, which I have no idea what that means other than it sounds fancy. I don't like to drop it at cocktail parties. But I sort of got perturbed at an OIG lawyer recently because she didn't grasp the concept of business entity. And I remain cool. And, it was a real struggle. And I know that was going to be a struggle because I was a government lawyer. And I liked, when I was in law school, I liked business associations, business organizations. There was something about it that made sense to me. A lot of people struggle with it. A lot of lawyers struggle with it.
That's interesting.
That is, yes. The fact that it is a legal person, that's one of the big differences. And so basically you're buying this legal person when you buy the stock or you buy the LLC membership. With the assets, you're just buying the ability to do the business.
You're just buying the stuff.
Yeah. And now Medicare does recognize that when you do that, the provider number is essentially reassigned to you.
Okay.
It's reassigned to the new owner, which the good thing is that it doesn't change. If it's done correctly, there should not be any gap in billing, any break in billing. There should not be any hiccup in billing. The times that I've seen that happen are times that I haven't been involved, or just
came in late. You got pulled in because it became a problem.
I tell people I'm going to do crisis management. I go around fixing problems all day long. So that's something that you decide at the LOI stage. Now, I've written LOIs to give you the option, to give the purchaser the option if they want to switch from one type of purchase to another, from stock to asset or vice versa, that they can do that. I usually include some language like that, simply because it just gives you freedom to change your mind. But again, that is a stage that you need to talk to your CPA because there's tax liability involved.
And those conversations, once the deal is done, we can't make magic happen and fix anything. What you've done is done, and now you got to live with it. So you do want to get your CPA or tax advisor involved early on.
Yes. Now, one of the things that just came to mind, I was thinking about that little caveat I put in there that they can switch. when I write the LOI, I'm writing it for the purchaser. That my client, if I'm writing it, I only draft documents and sales in these transactions if I'm representing the purchaser, because the purchaser has the ability to pull the plug more so than the seller. Once the seller, well, the way I write my LOI is once the seller signs, they're pretty much on the line.
Okay.
Hey, they could have hired me.
Yeah.
I had this one lawyer friend, we were laughing, and that's another thing I do is people call me up, tell me their problems, and I just bust out laughing because some of them was just so stupid. I did. Well, I had this one client, I love her, Josie Lightfoot. She's gone now, but she's no longer with us. But I remember one time she called me up and she told me what had happened with some snafu had happened with her agency, some service delivery problem, and I laughed for about 5 minutes, and she patiently waited for me to stop. But it was just so funny, whatever it was. But that's it's never a dull day. We were talking. He goes, "Yeah," and to be honest with you, I've seen documents I've drafted circulate in other deals. I know they're mine because I format things in a certain way. I can spot my document.
I was going to say, you want to be careful about taking somebody else's document.
We're not even talking about tracking metadata.
You may or may not be reviewing a document for me that I stole from another CPA for this very purpose. Yeah. Little Michelle is buying into the firm. And so I was like, well, my buddy already did that in Ohio. And so I went and changed as much as I could, but I didn't use that document without getting an attorney. So I need you to finish that up.
Well, this guy, I know, it's on my list. This guy says, well, I had this client who comes to me and he says, I just used that last document that you drafted for us when I sold or bought. Well, this time the guy was doing the opposite of what had happened. And he was talking about the deal. And the lawyer said, when I wrote it before, I wrote it in your favor. And now you just turned it around and it's in you used the same document. Great. It's in their favor now.
Wow.
And so there are little things, like I said, they're just little things you put in there. And my job is to protect my client's interests. So,
and we've already established that it cost you a whole lot less to get the professional guidance up front versus fixing the problems that come later.
Well, there are situations where people have wound up having to pay back the purchase price plus. I mean, it's not common, but it happens. That is one of your biggest exposures. So the LOI will determine whether it's a stock purchase or asset purchase. And then also it'll discuss how the purchase price is paid. Mm-hmm. Will you do it owner financing? Will they have an SBA loan or will they have any type of loan? Well, it's all in there, or at least generally speaking at a very high level. But it gives you some idea. It also sets out, this is when due diligence, and I say this, they can all say different things. This is the way I do it, but it'll say, this is where, you have so long to do due diligence. After that date, then these things happen. And either the seller is locked in or the purchaser is locked in. If something happens at a certain date. And I do that because if you put hard and fast dates in there, it just keeps things moving. Mm-hmm. It keeps things from stalling. And the biggest thing that'll kill a deal is if things stall. Yeah. And so now, usually don't have that happening because everybody wants everything done yesterday. And
that was the other note I took. This whole thing of rushing and thinking that, on December 10th, you're going to close by the end of the year.
And I have never understood that. Well, I know I had I had somebody the other day, they were wanting to close like on a 10th. And I'm like, why don't you close it like the end of the month or something?
Well, yeah, that would be a lot easier on your accountant.
Well, I know. But it's like so many, and even this time, even in November, if you were able to close in November, you could wait until January 1st. That'd make it so much cleaner on so many ways, but whatever.
But my point is, you cannot rush this, and these things don't happen quickly. And when you get a buyer that says we can close in 60 days, well, good luck.
Knock yourself out.
Yeah.
And, you can do that on. I mean, I have helped people do quick ones, but
but they're usually fire sales, aren't they?
They are, yeah. Or
So
it's
if
just
you're a
one where,
seller-
or it's one. It's just small deals. You can't do a bigger deal that way because you certainly need to do more due diligence and stuff.
Yeah.
So let me see. So after you get through the due diligence, the LOI is there. You then agree, the buyer then agrees to go forward. What you do then is you have a stock purchase agreement or asset purchase agreement or LLC, a membership purchase agreement. And that will spell out in more detail about what, it spells out in more concrete terms.
Yeah, everything.
How everything's going to happen.
Tax implications.
Yes,
Who's responsible for this, that, what's going to be held back in escrow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then also there are warranties that the seller makes as to the fitness of the business. It says, I'm using that term generally, it'll say in the document what you're warranting and representing. Same for the buyer, that they're representing, they have the ability to pay, they have to do this, that, and the other. This is one of the things that comes up a lot with smaller purchases is owner financing. When I'm representing the purchaser, I'm not a big fan of owner financing because I don't care what they promise you or what they do to secure the loan. Okay, they're going to give you a lien on the stock so that you can get it back in case they fail to pay. By the time they fail to pay, it's party over.
Yeah,
I mean, it's just
worthless.
you're not getting stock back in the same agency that you sold.
Yeah.
And so now if you want to agree to it, knock yourself out, go after it. But I mean, I put in all sorts of protections for my client when I do that, but they're paper. I mean, it's paper's paper. I mean, and so but everybody, a lot of clients, I mean, sellers, if they do owner financing, they get a big fat down payment. I sometimes wonder if they're just not satisfied with that. I don't know. Never have understood that because I've seen some that did not necessarily aggressively pursue the failure of a buyer to pay, or especially if it went under or something like that. That doesn't happen a lot. It happens though. But with all of that, so and in this midst, you have a massive regulatory component going on that you have to maneuver through and around. Now, I mentioned with Medicare that if the EIN, the employee identification number, the federal tax ID doesn't change, Medicare doesn't consider it a change of ownership.
Right.
All right. If the hospice or home health is less than 3 years old, there's going to be a problem with that. I mean, there's a 36-month rule, which is another story in and of itself.
But does a stock purchase protect against that?
No, that's it. They broadly define.
That's new.
Used to, Texas rules for licensure were broadly written. They just said ownership. If ownership changes hands, regardless of what kind, it's a child. And it was like 50% or more, 51% or more, something like that. That's the way the 36-month rule is written. Majority ownership. It doesn't matter what kind. If there's a shift in it, then within 36 months, then it affects
So
the billing.
even if there's a
It
change,
affects the billing privileges. Is what I want to. Billing privileges is what I want to say.
even if there's a change in the ownership of the entity still owns the provider number.
Yeah.
So there's no
the entity
change.
is the licensure. They're the provider.
Okay.
The provider number is like just another asset.
Yeah.
So,
well, see, the way I always read it, and this might be old, and we might be getting too far in the weeds, is that the asset of the provider number is owned by that EIN number. That EIN number doesn't change, therefore the ownership of the provider doesn't change.
Yes, that's it. Exactly. That's why partnerships are different, because if you have 50% or more of a partnership change hands, the EIN needs to change.
Yeah, if 51% of that partnership changes, that partnership is dissolved. It's effectively...
Well, I wonder how many partnerships out there have had that and they never did do anything about it.
We have one on the roster. Yeah. And I'm like, I don't even know what to do with this, because when you bought, this is all wrong. Of course, they had no attorneys involved.
Yeah.
Small deal.
Well,
it still matters.
I mean, I have to say, we've known each other for 20 years. I was so proud after knowing you and answering that question. A lot of times over the first 10 years, you finally understood it. And then you stopped answering. So, yeah, you're like, you got it down. But it's complicated. That's the thing that I've made a mistake years ago when I first started practicing, thinking, well, if I can understand this, it ought to be y'all to be able to. But, well, I also went to law school. Forget that. I forget that. But it's it's just like what the tax situation. It is complicated.
Yeah.
Don't underestimate how complicated it is.
Yeah.
And you could easily misstep. Yeah. You're going to see plenty of people who do it on their own. They go through it and they're fine. Everything works out fine. Everybody's fine. Everybody goes about they ride off into the sunset and then over. I can point to so many situations that went wrong with just this one little fact issue.
And that regulatory, don't you have to alert the state so many days?
It depends. Now, in Texas now, on the licensure side, stock purchase, LLC membership purchase, that's not a chow. But if it's an asset purchase, you have a notice issue. You have all these applications. It's a different type of application. On Medicaid, it's different there. And again, if you are now with managed care, the managed care contracts are all different. Your private insurance contracts are all different. Your VA contracts are different. I mean, so all of these have to be taken into consideration. Normally, when I have a client, I represent a purchaser, I'll ask for all their contracts because they're going to have to produce them and do due diligence anyway.
Yeah.
Provider contracts. And then what we do is I just make a chart and I put what section dictates what kind of notice has to be followed and that sort of thing.
And that was always one of the advantages of a stock purchase was, again, you're buying that EIN and that EIN has all those contracts. And so in most cases, the contract stayed with the EIN and it wasn't a whole bunch of regulatory work to go through.
Yeah. The funny thing is it was really a few years when asset purchases started, people used to do them, but then there were some changes and people gravitated to stock purchases now. One of the reasons, though, I would probably have advised people to go towards a stock purchase, which is, again, not your normal business advice because you have the potential to inherit liability. It's just sort of what you're talking about. The last situation I had was a partnership changed hands. So it was a chow. There was a full blown, everything's changing over, new EIN and everything. And most of the Medicaid managed care organizations, the HMOs, they were okay. But a couple of them balked. And it doesn't take but a couple of them to put you in a bind. But they stop paying. And
because basically they're saying, hey, no. We made a contract with ABC Partnership, and now you're turning into XYZ Partnership. You got new partners. We don't have a contract with them. Yeah. And that's where the whole asset purchase thing became difficult.
Now, with stock purchase, membership purchases, there will be some LLC that'll balk, MCO or HMO that balks. But that's more manageable. And all of those contracts are written differently. The thing that and so basically you have to read them because when I write a contract for something like that and I want to notice, I specifically state if this happens, you have to send me this kind of notice. All right. With a lot of these, they'll have it buried in there, literally, where you have to it'll be in the middle of a paragraph. If your credentialing information changes, you have this amount of time to notice this. Well, if you have new owners, that's new credentialing. Your credentialing information has changed. So you have new owners. You have to disclose that and all that. But most of the HMOs have been, for the most part, not been, I'm talking about the Medicaid managed care organizations. They have not been very difficult. I've not had to deal with any Medicaid Advantage plans where it was been difficult with a purchase or seller purchase. But a few years ago, especially in Texas, after Medicaid pretty much went full, because there is still some traditional Medicaid, full managed care, we started running into problems with people doing asset purchases because one or two would balk and then we'd have to work through it. And it was just a mess. But I was looking here, making sure I get everything. So again, there's no one way to go about this. You can, all of this that I'm talking about, I mean, it's not yet written. I mean, and people think, oh, you use forms. Well, yeah, but all those forms, we have to go through them each time, change this, make it fit to your situation.
Yeah. I've never seen one yet that's been the same.
No.
So, and we're not even getting into the taxing implications because those of you that know me, I don't really do tax.
Well, I'll tell you, I know of a transaction. It was an asset purchase. I know a transaction that a couple $1 million transaction that fell through close to the end because fortunately the buyer, as a seller, realized that the way they were characterizing the assets was going to really burden them with a huge tax burden.
Yes.
So,
and the difference between an asset purchase and stock purchase are like one is good for one party and not the other, and vice versa. Mm-hmm. So like a seller wants a stock purchase because if you're a seller and you sell a stock purchase, you get to walk away. You're done. Mm-hmm. If you sell as an asset purchase, you still own your entity. Yes. You've got to wind it down. You have to file final tax returns, final cost reports, all that.
That's
stuff.
Another thing with a chow, with an asset purchase, you have to file a final cost report. I can't tell you how many times I've gotten calls from a purchaser who, and honestly, it's in the purchaser's interest to make sure that happens.
I tell them
I've gotten calls from purchasers saying, hey, our money's been cut off. I'm like, did you file a final cost report? What's that? And
what they'll say is, so what he means is, let's say somebody sells effective 5/1 or 5/31 of the year. So the seller has a cost report from 1/1 to 5/31. Then the buyer picks up from 6/1 to 12/31. So the buyer probably filed their cost report.
Yeah. But last one closing it out.
Yeah. And the buyer is like, well, that was the seller's responsibility. Maybe it was per your agreement, but all that matters is you bought that provider number.
Ain't time to get pissy about that. It's just about, well, you want to fix that.
Yeah, well, and that's what I tell them. It doesn't matter. What you should do in your agreement is deduct from the sales price $5,000 to get the cost report done and make sure the buyer picks up and gets all the records. I can't tell you how many deals I've seen where they don't even have records for that period, especially like startup kind of, they don't even have records, and I'm supposed to do a cost report and a tax return. Well, what am I supposed to use for that? But I tell them, get what you need to do a cost report, deduct discount the price by $5,000, and you, the buyer, take responsibility. Because if it doesn't get done, it's coming on you, and your seller might be in Jamaica and not give a shit.
You really sort of hit on a big thing that both parties need to be. They need to be engaged.
Yeah.
They need to be knowing what's going on, knowing what their options are at each step. You can't do that without professional advice.
Yeah.
But it takes active engagement. Now, I shouldn't have a pet peeve about it, but I do. I sit down with clients sometimes and they tell me before they've even looked at anything wanting to buy an agency, they tell me things they want in the stock purchase, the purchase agreement. Well, we want to make sure that we don't inherit any of, ABC, the old owner's liability. I'm like, we want to be, I just was like, I would not have thought about that. I'm so glad you brought that up. Let me make a note, because I wouldn't include that. I wouldn't protect your interest. No, I just sort of like draft something and you just be hanging in the wind. No, I'm like, but I know they mean good and everything, but it's like, it happens all the time.
So what you're saying, let me translate.
We're not supposed to talk about our pet peeves, but anyway.
But you're talking in lingo from what I know what you're talking about. But you're saying that they're coming in and telling you, oh, be sure you protect me in this agreement.
Yes.
And you're sitting here, well, why the hell do you think I have been hired? My job is to protect you. I don't need you to give me that special little
It's
note.
just a pet peeve. And it's like, I know with it. And usually people are saying it. Well, some of them are annoying, but most of them are really sweet. And so, I can't hold it against them, but it's like, okay, that's what I do.
That's the basic.
And hopefully, I wish somebody would listen to this, because hopefully they'd know that when I draft things, it is in my client's interest.
Yeah.
So if you're on the other side and you ain't got a lawyer,
Yep.
have at it. So,
Yeah.
But the funny,
What about brokers?
you know what? If you get a good broker, brokers have the ability to put you in front of more buyers. If you're a seller, they're tapped into the market. They know they call it go in the market. If you go to market, they know where to take you.
Yeah.
And so, but I've seen brokers who they introduce people and they're done. They want their money. As soon as the transaction closes, whatever, they want their money. Even if the seller hasn't received all their money, they want their money. That's just, and a lot of times the seller had already agreed to that well before you get to the deal.
Here's my pet peeve with brokers. And it's not with brokers per se. My pet peeve in M&A is client gets a call, unsolicited call from a broker.
Mm-hmm.
And the broker's like, hey, I've got a buyer for you. But the broker is not completely truthful.
Mm-hmm.
They're like, I have a lot of buyers. I'm looking for sellers. It's not, and my clients will call and they're like, hey, this broker called and they've got somebody that wants to buy my agency. And I have to talk them down and say, you can go through with their process if you want, but don't assume that they truly have a specific buyer looking specifically at your area, at your kind of agency. They're probably just fishing for sellers. And so what I do is I tell them, I said, they're going to run you through the ringer. They're going to make you they're going to put you a market analysis, or they call them stuff. But for them to put that together for you, you're going to have to do a whole lot of work and provide a lot of information.
Yes.
And that's on you.
And there might be situations where you have to really work on your books to get them to where they need to be.
Yeah, that's a whole nother
I don't know
topic.
what that means. I just hear you complain about it.
Yes, that's a whole other conversation. But
well, the first deal I did, it was in 2005. I left the state, and Steve Braff was the broker. And at first I'm like, I didn't know anything about him. He was with the Braff Group. He's since retired. And I was like, okay, what's this broker about? Anyway, the thing that impressed me about Steve, he kept working after the deal closed. He was still working on the deal after it closed. And what I've noticed is that really good brokers get to know their clients well before any deal any deal comes up. And Beth Da Silva is also a good one. She works hard. That's what I like. I mean, it just makes me.
I thought she was
she's a broker.
She was an attorney.
She's a broker.
Oh, okay.
Fleet Bridge Pacific.
Okay.
She's in San Diego.
Okay.
And it's a joy to talk to. For me, at least. You might not like her. I'm just saying. I'm not saying y'all. I mean, I've learned. I like a lot of people, so I have to be really careful because I have introduced people who just didn't really like each other at all.
And we have Don Harmon. He does a lot of small deals.
That was a good point because Don. That's it. I don't really know anybody right now. If they come to me with an agency that has a very low census, I don't know anybody else to send them to, really.
Yeah.
You have, the three that we talked about each handle a different market. He's with DFW Business Exchange.
Yeah.
And just as a caveat, you hire any of these people, hey, you need to look them up because do your own due diligence. We love them, but you might not like them.
Yeah.
But yes, Don is very, I made the mistake one time of saying, I'll help a client with a sale, and we put an anonymous ad in a publication that was going to get attention and had them like maybe call, I don't know if they called my office or they did that. Sent to some sort of email or something. Bottom line is we had a ton of people coming around kicking the tires. Well, I mean,
were you representing a buyer or a seller?
I was representing a seller.
Okay.
And we had a bunch of and here's the thing, brokers hopefully will keep you from wasting a whole bunch of time. And they will take a lot of, they get,
they get a big chunk of change.
A big chunk of change, but they can save you from having to deal with people wasting your time.
Yeah.
And that may not, if you got all the time in the world, do it yourself.
And mine was kind of the opposite. It broke my heart because I saw it so many times where a client would get that call from a broker. Hey, we've got a buyer for you. The client would get all excited. They weren't necessarily looking to sell, but then when somebody presented the idea, they're like, hey, this might be a great opportunity. And I just warned them, you're going to spend a lot of time putting a lot of stuff together, and they may or may not have a real buyer. And 9 times out of 10, it was a nothing burger.
Well, that's the thing is, it's easy to call somebody up and say, hey, I got a buyer.
Yeah.
Well, it could be somebody you talk to in the grocery store, say, I'm thinking about buying that.
Yeah.
But the definition of a buyer there is very limited.
My latest favorite, and I'm talking in this last 12 months, I've had a couple of buyers, and you know them too, but they'll post out or they'll reach out and they're looking for a profitable agency, like all this stuff, like a really good package. I'm like, well, you understand they don't want to sell. Because they're not struggling, they're doing well. Yeah. They're not in it for the growth and then punching out, and it just kind of cracks me up. That's the latest I've seen. I'm like, why do you think they'd want to sell?
One of my, one of the things that I've talked to clients about, just help them as much as I could. I gave them any data I could find. There are reports out there that you can pull and you can sort of figure out which agencies are suffering and which agencies are doing well, depending on what program they're in, Medicare, Medicaid, certified, PD. And so I have had some clients be very clever and strategic.
Yep.
And they look for people who are struggling and needing to sell. And so that's really interesting. So there's a way to do that.
Remember, your cost Medicare, I think, and probably Medicaid cost reports are public information.
Well, and that's actually what one client, I learned this 20 years ago because I was surprised somebody asked me to do a public information request for cost reports. Why? Because, and believe it or not, you get in a really succinct form. It's easy to go through, and because they were looking for fire sales.
Yep.
And so, anyway, so there are different ways of going about looking for something like that. But yeah, if somebody's doing well, you're going to be paying a premium because you're going to be paying somebody to give up something that they're not necessarily thinking about giving up.
Yeah.
You're going to have to convince them. And so,
I just like to caution those clients, just say, hey, I'm not saying don't do it. I'm just trying to paint a picture of what you're getting into, and then it may end up being nothing. That's not a bad exercise, though. That's another thing.
That is, you learn more from mistakes. And
we're going really long on time, but
well, you keep talking.
I know. Going through that due diligence process, that was some of where I learned so much in my early days. But you really can learn how you need to clean up your agency to then be positioned to sell. So I don't think it's necessarily a bad idea.
Oh, I don't think so either. It's just like a mock survey.
Yeah.
It's a good exercise. You learn more from your mistakes than you do accidental success.
Yeah.
So actually my favorite person who does due diligence, now she will go to town on it. She will, but that woman will find stuff that.
Who's that?
No, I don't say. Jan Spears. All right. MJS and Associates. The woman is extremely thorough. I've actually had clients who hired her to do work complain that she's so thorough, but that woman can find stuff. It's pretty interesting. She's just got a knack for it. But that's because she's tenacious, tedious, and very detailed.
And she's done it for years.
Yeah.
Years.
Had her own agency.
I can feel my ab workout from yesterday.
Well, good.
Get a little sore.
Yeah. All right. Well, that should cover it. We sort of actually added on a little bit there. So y'all got some lagniappe.
So what?
Lagniappe, a little something extra.
Oh, is that what that is?
It's a Louisiana word. Yeah, lagniappe. It looks like lasagna itself with cheese and peas. Sort of. It is. Anyway. Lagniappe, it's like a little something extra. We gave you a little something extra. So
okay.
Like if you get you go and it's like a sundae, you put a cherry on top. The cherry on top's a little something extra.
Okay. Okay. All right. Well, I've seen that word. I know I've seen it.
Yeah. I think there's more than one restaurant, or at least a restaurant somewhere named Lagniappe.
Yeah.
But anyway, so that we went a little bit beyond the original what I planned, but that is a really good overview.
Yeah.
And what you heard a lot of times is why I spend the first maybe hour with clients explaining to them. This went into a lot of detail that we will not necessarily do each time, but that's a good overview of my like M&A, buying and selling, home health agencies, hospices 101.
Okay.
So
Cool.
all right.
All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.
Thanks so much for joining us on the Home Care Experience with TNA. We hope you enjoyed today's conversation and found it insightful. You can find more episodes of the Home Care Experience wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. We'd love it if you could share this podcast with your network and/or leave us a review. It really helps us reach more people who are passionate about home care and hospice. Visit thehomecareexperience.com for links and resources in the show notes. Until next time, take care and keep making a difference in the lives of those you serve.